Good morning, everyone. Before I get started, I want to give you a little update on our New Zealand team. We had a team of 7 that is in New Zealand. And let's see, it's almost 10 o'clock here, so that means it is 4 a.m. Monday morning in New Zealand. So, call them now, wake them up. Let everybody say, hey, we're thinking of you. You can be their alarm clock. They've had a great trip. The main responsibility they had was to help with this conference that the current church, that's the name of the church in New Zealand, is putting on. It's called Stronger, and this is a conference for all the churches in New Zealand. There's not a lot of churches in New Zealand, Christian churches in New Zealand, and so they started this conference last year as a way for the churches to come together for encouragement and worship and support and those type of things. And so Rick went last year and helped with the inaugural conference, and so they asked for a team to come this year and asked the team to handle the children's portion of the conference. And I don't think they had a children's portion last year, so they weren't expecting big numbers of kids, but they had triple the amount that they were expecting. And so our team did a great job with that. Rick has led 3 workshops for adults during this conference. They've also worked with the women's ministry of the church, and then they've spent a lot of time just with the staff and encouraging the staff. You may remember our friends Diego and Claudia Silva. They are now in New Zealand working at the current church with our missionaries Michael and Roz Trusty, and Rick said they were able to have a really nice dinner at the Silva's home earlier this week, and it was good to see them. They will be home Tuesday afternoon, which means I think they leave probably close to midnight or so Monday night their time, and so they have 100 hours of flying to go to get home. Actually, the flight from New Zealand to the States is 16 hours alone, and then they have another pretty decent flight after that. So pray for them and praise God for the good work that they've been able to do, and I'm sure Rick will fill all of us in when he gets back next week. Now, as with most journeys, you know this, you've been on a trip, you've been on a journey. Most journeys do not follow a direct route. Lots of things happen when you're on a trip, whether it's driving or flying. There's lots of turns, detours. If you're driving, there's road construction everywhere, that gets in the way and causes you to go off course. A couple years ago, Josh Smith and I were flying to Brazil to see the Silvas, and on the way home, our flight, which was supposed to be from Sao Paulo, Brazil, to Atlanta, and then Atlanta to Richmond. That flight from Brazil to Atlanta is 12 hours. And so we weren't looking forward to that, but okay, we're going to get home 12 hours. Well, we get close to Atlanta, and the pilot comes on and says, there's storms, heavy storms, all in the Atlanta area. Hey, I know you've been on this plane for 12 hours. We're going to circle around the airport for a little while. And so we circled around for another hour. And then the pilot comes back on and he says, sorry folks, they have closed the Atlanta airport due to the weather. They're going to divert us to Charlotte. And so we fly to Charlotte and we land in Charlotte, and guess what? All those storms in Atlanta caught up to us in Charlotte. And so we are sitting on the runway. They would not even let us taxi to a gate. We're sitting on the runway, and this storm just blows through. The whole plane's just rocking as the storm comes through. We sit on the runway for another hour. And then the pilot goes, well, we need to refuel. So they brought a fuel tanker out, refueled us. That took another, half hour, 45 minutes. And then he said, hey, we're going to fly back to Atlanta now. And so we flew back to Atlanta. All this, so what it was to be a 12-hour flight, we were on that plane for 15 hours, 16 hours. And then when we finally got to Atlanta, we had less than an hour to go through customs to try to catch our connecting flight to Richmond. And I don't know, I'll give praise to God and praise to Josh, because I was like, Josh, we're not going to make it. He's like, oh yeah, we'll make it. I said, no, we're not going to make it. We made it. And we got home finally, caught our flight, got home to Richmond. But that's what happens when you're on trips. Usually you think you're going one way, and then you end up zigzagging, and lots of things change, and there's lots of things that happen when you're on a journey, on a trip. Well, Mark chapter 8, as we're continuing this journey with Jesus, Mark chapter 8 is where things really start to turn and you get some zigzags and things happen. And Mark 8 is a real pivotal point in Mark's gospel. And in Mark chapter 8, the journey of Jesus takes a very serious turn. It takes a serious turn. The tone, the content of Jesus' teachings with his disciples, it becomes very, very serious. Jesus begins to lay out exactly what it means to follow him, and he's up front. It is not easy. It's not going to be easy. Following Jesus is not easy. It's not meant to be easy. Jesus did not sugarcoat it, nor did he set false expectations just so he could build up more followers and just have more people coming and gather around him. And really, that's a temptation. That's a temptation for us today to make following Jesus all about having a stress-free life. That, if you follow Jesus, all your troubles are going to go away. You're going to live a life free of difficulty, a life free of struggle. And that is not the case. That's not what Jesus promised, and that's not what I'm promising today. Jesus was real about what following him looked like. Mark chapter 8 begins a sifting out of those who are truly committed to following Jesus and those who are not. Those who liked being around Jesus in his day, they liked the power, they liked the healing, the miracles, they liked being the recipients of some of those things. And Jesus wanted to say, do you like these things? Do you want to be around these things? Or do you want to be with me? And that begins the sifting process here in Mark chapter 8. And Jesus does this by asking a few questions. Jesus asks 3 questions that provide a picture of what it means to follow him. So I would encourage you, if you have your Bibles, to go ahead and pull up Mark chapter 8. We're going to go all through Mark chapter 8 today. And we see there that the first question that Jesus poses that shows us what it means to follow him, he poses a question of discernment. He asks a question of discernment. Jesus asks his disciples in Mark chapter 8, verse 21, he says, do you still not understand? Do you still not understand? Now you can probably tell, Jesus asks this question as it's worded that way. He asks it out of frustration. He's frustrated with his disciples. And so let's see what happens leading up to this question. If you go back in Mark, you see Mark tells us that Jesus had just fed a large crowd of 4,000 men, miraculously with just 7 loaves of bread. And this is just like when Jesus fed over 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. So this is now the second time that the disciples have seen Jesus miraculously feed thousands of people. After feeding 4,000 people, Jesus and his disciples, they get into a boat and they travel to their next location. And we read that when they get out of the boat, there's a group of Pharisees there, those religious leaders of the day, Jesus' chief antagonists, and they come and they question Jesus. A routine tactic of the Pharisees was to demand a sign from heaven, from Jesus, to prove that he was sent from God, to prove his divinity, to prove his divine authority. To these Pharisees, the miracles that Jesus was performing, all the healings that are taking place, feeding thousands of people, all those different things, those weren't enough. Those didn't provide enough evidence for them. They demanded more proof. They demanded another sign, and Jesus refuses. So Jesus and the disciples, they leave the Pharisees, they get back in the boat, and Mark picks things up in Mark chapter 8, verses 14 through 21. Mark says the disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for 1 loaf that they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, it is because we have no bread. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see? And ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. He said to them, do you still not understand? The disciples were showing themselves to be similar to the Pharisees. That's what was causing this frustration from Jesus. They were acting just like the Pharisees. They were seeing all the incredible miracles that Jesus was performing, and yet they weren't seeing the big picture. Mark actually makes an observation about them 2 chapters earlier in Mark chapter 6, after the feeding of the 5,000. Mark chapter 6, verse 52. He says this for the disciples, for they had not understood about the loaves, their hearts were hardened. So he even makes that observation 2 chapters earlier. The disciples also weren't comprehending Jesus' teaching about the Pharisees. Jesus warns them about the yeast of the Pharisees. In the New Testament, yeast is a symbol of evil or corruption. Jesus is warning the disciples, don't be like them. Don't be like the Pharisees. The Pharisees were corrupt, and they used the law as a way to exalt themselves and to extort wealth and power from the people. They were hypocrites, and they held others to a different, much higher standard than they held themselves. They refused to see the divine nature and authority of Jesus. Instead of celebrating what Jesus was doing and worshiping God, they were threatened by Jesus, and they sought to destroy him. The disciples, as we see, are worried about not having enough food for the trip. Even after just witnessing Jesus miraculously provide food for thousands of people and have basketfuls of leftovers, they're worried about not having enough bread. They're concerned about something that they don't need to be concerned about. Concern and worry cloud our minds and harden our hearts to the important truths that God is trying to teach us. Jesus is trying to teach his disciples who he is, what his kingdom is about, and warning them to avoid the pitfalls of the Pharisees and those like them. But the disciples, they can't hear. They can't understand these big things because they're worried about little things that really they should not be worrying or concerned about. Jesus has a whole section in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 on worrying. And to summarize what Jesus says there, Jesus says, don't worry. God knows what we need. We're valuable to God. He will take care of us. Worrying does us no good. And Jesus concludes his teaching on worrying with these words in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. He says, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Don't worry. First and foremost, seek after God. Seek his kingdom. Seek his righteousness. And when we do this, our eyes will see, our ears will hear, and our hearts will be soft to what God is showing and teaching us. We should follow the example of King Solomon, who when presented by God with the opportunity to request anything, he asked for this in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 9. Solomon says, so give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. We must have a discerning heart to follow Jesus, a heart that seeks to know Jesus and that seeks his kingdom first. So this first question that Jesus asks is a question of discernment. The second question that Jesus poses that shows us what it means to follow him is a question of declaration. A question of declaration. Holly and I went on a little journey this week to Indiana and back, where our daughter Hope got married this week. And so, thank you. So it's exciting. We're excited for them. And it was a quick trip, a lot of driving, but beautiful ceremony, simple ceremony. And you know, I've of course attended a lot of weddings, officiated a lot of weddings, and every part of a wedding ceremony has a special meaning attached to it. But the two words that are the most powerful and that carry the greatest meaning, you know what these words are, right? The two words that carry the most meaning, that are most powerful, are the words, I do. I do. when the groom is asked point blank, do you take this woman to be your wife? And then the bride is asked point blank, do you take this man to be your husband? There can be no hedging in your answer. The answer can't be, I think so. I guess. No. It's a yes or no question. It's I do or I don't. This is a question of declaration. When the bride and groom say, I do, they are declaring before God, their family, and their friends that they are committing themselves to one another as husband and wife. Jesus asks his disciples a question of declaration. Mark chapter 8, verse 29, Jesus says, who do you say I am? Who do you say I am? Now, just before he asks this question, in Mark chapter 8, Jesus heals a blind man, and he does so in the weirdest way you can imagine. He spits on the man's eyes and then lays his hands on him. And after he does that, at first the man's sight isn't totally restored. Things are still a little bit blurry, probably because all the spit in his eyes. He was still blurry. And so then Jesus lays his hands on him again, and his sight is fully restored. And I think that Jesus, in some ways, is using this miracle to teach the disciples about their own spiritual blindness, and about how they've only been able to partially see what Jesus' ministry and purpose are all about, but now they're about to fully see. They're about to see very clearly what following Jesus is about. And so after Jesus heals this man, we go to Mark chapter 8, verse 27 through 29, and we read that Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way he asked them, who do people say I am? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. But what about you, he asked. Who do you say I am? Peter answered, you are the Christ. Now it appears that the disciples have learned that lesson of discernment, and now they understand better who Jesus is. Peter, he speaks up, and his answer isn't just for him. He's kind of the spokesman of all the disciples, so he's speaking for the group. And he and they are declaring that Jesus is the Christ. He is the Son of God. He is the Savior of the world. It is a bold declaration of faith. This question of declaration is one that Jesus requires every person to answer. Everybody must answer this question of who do you say I am? It's the most important question that you will ever be asked. Paul writes in Romans chapter 10, verse 9, he says that if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, declaration of faith, declaring that Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. We must make a bold declaration of faith to follow Jesus. A declaration of faith that tells the world that we believe that Jesus is the Christ, that he is the Son of God. So the second question here, the second question Jesus asks, it's one of declaration. And then finally, this last question that Jesus poses that shows us what it means to follow him, it's a question of denial. It's a question of denial. We're in this season of Lent. Ash Wednesday was this past week, and Lent is not something that we've historically really emphasized at Fairmount, but most of us are all familiar somewhat with Lent. Lent is this 40-day period that begins on Ash Wednesday and it ends on Holy Saturday, that day between the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. The purpose of Lent is spiritual renewal and to prepare to worship Christ around his death, burial, and resurrection. The most recognized part of Lent is fasting, and Lent is patterned after Jesus' 40 days of fasting in the wilderness after his baptism. And during Lent, people, they fast, they abstain from something for 40 days. A lot of times it's a certain food or a certain drink, something that's become very popular here in the last few years as people will abstain from social media for 40 days. But the point of fasting is to humble ourselves before God, to spend time in prayer, and draw closer to Him. Lent is a time to reflect on the sacrifice that Christ made for us on the cross and to ask oneself, what am I willing to give up for God? What am I willing to sacrifice for Jesus? Am I willing to deny myself for God? At the end of Mark chapter 8, Jesus asks this question of denial, and it's phrased in a little bit different way than you might imagine, but it's a question about what we're willing to sacrifice for God. In Mark chapter 8, verse 36, Jesus asks, what good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Now, immediately after Peter makes this bold declaration of faith that Jesus is the Christ, Jesus immediately tells his disciples, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to be killed, and I'm going to rise again 3 days later. Hard teachings, difficult teachings. This begins a very difficult teaching that Jesus shares with his disciples and the crowd who's present. And the disciples, they don't want to hear it, especially Peter. He doesn't want to hear about this. He pushes back on Jesus, and Jesus rebukes Peter rather angrily. And then Mark tells us that right after this rebuke, in Mark 8:34, then Jesus called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, anyone who would come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. One scholar writes this. He says, by denial of self, Jesus does not mean to deny oneself of something, kind of like what we do in Lent. It's not about just denying yourself of one thing or a habit or something. Jesus means to renounce self, to cease to make self the object of one's life and actions. He says, God, not self, must be at the center of life. Your life must be centered around God, not this world, if you're going to follow Jesus. That's difficult. That's a difficult teaching. That's a high bar. You can gain everything there is to have in this world, but without Christ, it means nothing. This world is temporary, and so are its pleasures and riches and all the good things that come along with it. They're temporary. And so Jesus warns his disciples. He's warning us. Don't trade what is temporary for what is eternal. Place the right value on the right things. In verse 31, as I said, Jesus tells his disciples he's going to be killed. And now in verse 34, Jesus gets even more specific. And he implies that his death would be by crucifixion. Take up your cross. The images of crucifixion, sadly, were very familiar to the Jews of Jesus' day. The Romans used crucifixion as a form of fear and torture and, of course, execution. And so when Jesus says that someone who wants to follow him must be willing to take up their cross, he's bringing to mind a scene that his audience knows. They've seen this before. A man already condemned, required to carry the beam of his own cross to the place of execution. It's humiliating. It's embarrassing. It's torture. And it's no coincidence that this is exactly what we see Jesus having to do himself. In John chapter 19, verse 17, the Apostle John tells us about Jesus carrying his own cross. He went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. Jesus never asks us to do something that he hasn't done or wasn't willing to do himself. We must be willing to deny ourselves and sacrifice everything to follow Jesus. This last question Jesus asks is a question of denial. Now, this journey has taken a serious turn here in Mark chapter 8, and it's important that we understand and that what Jesus communicated here, that a journey with Jesus includes a journey to the cross. It includes a journey to the cross. Remember Mark's audience. We said this a few weeks ago. Mark is writing to Christians who are suffering greatly in Rome. They're being persecuted by the emperor. It's horrible. People are being executed. They're being killed. They're being tortured. And the major theme of Mark, in light of all of this that's taking place, is that Christ is greater. Christ is greater than the emperor. Christ is greater than your suffering. Christ is greater than death. And so Mark's encouragement is follow Jesus. Serve him. Don't give up. Jesus is greater than all these things. Life with Jesus is not always going to be perfect. There's going to be difficulties. There's going to be suffering. Eventually, there is going to be death. However, there will also be life, eternal life in heaven with him. I think the Apostle Paul says it best, and I love these verses of Paul. Philippians chapter 3, verses 10 and 11. He says, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow to attain to the resurrection from the dead. You know, the last couple weeks, I've been watching the Olympics when I get a chance. Haven't been able to watch probably as much as I want, but I catch little snippets here and there of the Olympics. And I was watching the other day. I just marvel at these Olympians, these athletes. They are in such incredible shape. They push their bodies to do things that just don't even seem possible. You know that after 30 seconds, me and you would be on the floor, and they just keep going, and it's remarkable of what they do. I was watching an event, a women's skiing event the other day, and it was basically it's like a 10K up a mountain, and they're skiing. I think alpine skiing event or something like that. 10K, 6.2 miles, and they're going as fast as they can, and they complete this. The top medal winners, they completed this in less than 20 minutes or less. I mean, we're talking just over 3 minutes a mile that they're going doing this. It's incredible. And as you're watching them, you could see about halfway through the race, a lot of them really they're grimacing. You can tell they're in pain. And they just keep going along. And as they get to the end, the announcers are like, I don't know if this person's going to be able to make it. And you can kind of see their legs and arms are kind of getting wobbly. And it reminded me, I always like watching whenever it's on. I like watching those Ironman triathlons, like in Hawaii, they show that, and you get to the end of the triathlon, and the person be running toward the finish line, and like their legs don't work, their arms don't work, and they're kind of flopping around, and they're just trying to make it to the finish line. That's kind of what was happening, except they were on skis, right? And so they're going and they're doing this, and finally, they would one by one, they're crossing the finish line, and they collapse on the ground, and then they just start screaming in pain. And they're just laying there on the ground, and then they can't get up, and eventually one of their teammates or coach or somebody comes and kind of lifts them up and gets them up on their feet and is encouraging them and telling them, you did it, you finished, you did great, good job, and they're just trying to get them going. I think following Jesus is kind of a lot like that race. Jesus wants his followers to give him everything that we have. Pour everything we have into following him. Leave nothing behind. Exert every ounce of life and energy and everything we have into following him. And it's going to be a struggle. It's going to be painful at times. But he's going to be there with us, cheering us on, helping us through. And when we collapse at that finish line, he's going to come and he's going to pick us up out of the grave to life. And he's going to celebrate with us because we did it. We lived a life of faith. We finished the race. And we followed him. This morning, if you haven't started following him, I would love to talk to you more about that we're going to have another song of worship, and as we do that, I'm going to be down here, and if you want to talk to me about what it means to follow Jesus, maybe you need to be baptized today, I would love to talk to you about that. If you please stand with me as Bill and the team lead us in one more song.